The village of Bramblewood had always prided itself on maintaining the sort of Christmas traditions that city dwellers imagined when they spoke wistfully of proper English villages. On this particular December afternoon, just 4 days before Christmas Eve, the annual Christmas Bazaar was proceeding with all the comfortable predictability that such events required. The village hall had been transformed into a wonderland of red and green bunting, fragrant evergreen boughs, and the warm glow of countless fairy lights strung with more enthusiasm than precision by the local scout troop. Miss Jane Marple sat in a wooden chair positioned strategically near the tea stall, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a soft blue jumper for some fortunate child. Her pale eyes, however, were far from idle, taking in the familiar pageantry of village life with the practiced attention of someone who understood that human nature revealed itself most clearly in moments of supposed celebration. At her age, though she would never have been so indelicate as to specify exactly what that age might be, she had learned that the most interesting dramas often unfolded against the most innocent backdrops. The Bramblewood Christmas Bazaar Committee had outdone themselves this year, largely due to the tireless efforts of Mrs. Millicent Harrington, whose organizational abilities were matched only by her determination to ensure that every detail met her exacting standards. Mrs. Harrington was a woman of considerable presence, with silver hair arranged in waves that never dared to stray from their appointed positions, and a manner that suggested she had been personally commissioned by the Almighty to oversee village festivities. She moved between the various stalls with the efficiency of a field marshal, her sharp eyes noting every misplaced doily and improperly folded tablecloth. The committee itself represented a cross-section of Bramblewood society, each member bringing their own particular talents and, as Miss Marple had quietly observed, their own carefully guarded secrets. Colonel James Weatherby, the committee's treasurer, cut an impressive figure despite his 72 years, his military bearing still evident in his straight shoulders and precise movements. He had moved to Bramblewood 5 years earlier after retiring from a distinguished army career, though village gossip suggested that certain gambling debts in London had made a change of scenery advisable. Miss Prudence Ashworth, the village librarian, fluttered about the bookstall with nervous energy, her tendency to adjust her spectacles every few minutes betraying an anxiety that seemed at odds with her quiet profession. At 58, she remained unmarried, devoted to caring for her invalid mother and managing the village library with meticulous care. Recent months, however, had seen her displaying an uncharacteristic interest in fashion, magazines, and taking what she termed research trips to London with suspicious frequency. The Reverend Dr. Timothy Blackwood represented the church's interests with the gentle authority of a man comfortable in his calling. His scholarly appearance and soft-spoken manner masked what Miss Marple had observed to be a surprisingly keen business sense, a quality that had proven invaluable in managing the church's restoration fund, which stood to benefit significantly from the day's proceeds. Mrs. Vivian Cartwright, the newest addition to both the village and the committee, brought an element of sophisticated glamour that stood in marked contrast to Bramblewood's usual understated charm. She had arrived 8 months earlier with her husband, a successful London businessman, and had thrown herself into village life with an enthusiasm that seemed almost theatrical in its intensity. Her perfectly styled auburn hair and expensive clothes marked her as someone accustomed to a different sort of life, though her smiles, Miss Marple had noted, never quite reached her eyes. The final member of the committee was Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton, whose 30 years as the village bank manager had earned him both respect and the natural role of financial overseer for village events. His meticulous nature had saved the committee from numerous potential embarrassments over the years, though his increasingly frequent absences from recent meetings had not escaped notice. As Miss Marple observed the gentle chaos of the bazaar, she was struck by the undercurrents of tension that seemed to flow beneath the surface of the festivities like a dark stream beneath winter ice. There was something in the way Mrs. Harrington's jaw tightened when she spoke to Mr. Pemberton, something in Colonel Weatherby's too hearty laughter when discussing the day's proceeds, something in Miss Ashworth's nervous glances toward the door whenever someone new entered the hall. "Such a lovely turnout this year," observed Mrs. Jenkins, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a cup of tea and a satisfied sigh. Mrs. Jenkins served as the village's unofficial chronicler of social events, a role she fulfilled with enthusiasm, if not always with complete accuracy. Though, I must say, there's been rather a lot of whispering about money matters lately. Not that it's any of my business, of course. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "Money matters do seem to occupy people's thoughts rather more during the Christmas season," she replied mildly. "All those presents to buy, and charitable causes to support." "Oh, it's not about Christmas spending," Mrs. Jenkins said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "It's about last year's bazaar funds. Mr. Pemberton's been asking rather pointed questions about the accounting, and Mrs. Harrington's been looking positively thunderous whenever the subject comes up. £300, they say, that can't be properly accounted for." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Mrs. Cartwright had arrived, her cheeks flushed from the cold air and her eyes bright with what might have been excitement or anxiety. She made her way directly to Mrs. Harrington, speaking in urgent, hushed tones that carried an unmistakable note of distress. "I simply must speak with the committee," Mrs. Cartwright was saying, her usual composure noticeably strained. "It's about the auction items. There's been a most disturbing development." Mrs. Harrington's expression grew even more severe, if such a thing were possible. "What sort of development, Vivian? We're due to begin the auction in 20 minutes. It's the Pemberton family heirloom, the silver tea service that was donated for the main lot. I've just had a telephone call from London. It seems there may be some question about its provenance." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the cheerful bustle of the bazaar continued, but Miss Marple noticed how several conversations seemed to pause, how certain heads turned almost imperceptibly toward the small drama unfolding near the entrance. Mr. Pemberton himself appeared at that moment, emerging from behind the white elephant stall with his arms full of miscellaneous items that needed pricing. His usually neat appearance was somewhat disheveled, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the December chill. "Geoffrey," Mrs. Harrington called sharply, "we need to discuss the auction lots. There seems to be some confusion about the silver service." The effect of her words on Mr. Pemberton was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from his face, and the items in his arms scattered to the floor with a crash that drew startled looks from across the hall. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mouth working silently as if searching for words that refused to come. That is to say, surely there's been some mistake," he stammered finally. "The service has been in my family for generations. There couldn't possibly be any question about its ownership." Colonel Weatherby had approached with the measured step of a man accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. His sharp eyes moved between Pemberton's stricken face and Mrs. Cartwright's tense expression. "What exactly has happened, Vivian?" Mrs. Cartwright glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention their conversation was attracting. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. There are certain irregularities that have come to light regarding items that were reported stolen from a London estate several years ago." The silence that followed was so complete that Miss Marple could hear the grandfather clock in the corner ticking away the seconds. She observed each face in turn, noting the various expressions of shock, calculation, and what might have been relief on features that had suddenly lost their festive cheer. It was then that young Timothy Fletcher, the vicar's son, came running through the hall doors with the wild-eyed look of a child who had witnessed something far beyond his understanding. "Mummy," he cried, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet hall. "Mummy, there's a man in the churchyard, and I think he's dead." The words fell on the gathering like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward in ever-widening circles. Mrs. Harrington was the first to recover, her organizational instincts asserting themselves even in the face of catastrophe. "Timothy, what exactly did you see?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pallor that had crept across her features. "He's lying by the old yew tree," the boy gasped, still struggling to catch his breath. "All twisted up, and there's blood on his head, and his eyes are staring, but he won't answer when I called to him." Dr. Morrison, who had been quietly examining the preserve's stall, pushed through the crowd with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to medical emergencies. "I'd better have a look," he said grimly. "Timothy, can you show me exactly where?" As a small procession formed to follow the doctor to the churchyard, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting temporarily forgotten in her lap. Her sharp eyes had caught something that the others, in their shock and confusion, had missed entirely. In the moment when young Timothy had burst through the doors with his dreadful news, she had seen Mr. Pemberton's face transform from the pallor of fear to something that looked remarkably like relief. It was, she reflected, a most interesting reaction for a man whose financial irregularities had just been exposed to discover that someone had died. Unless, of course, the death and the irregularities were connected in ways that were not yet apparent to anyone else. The Christmas bazaar, with its cheerful decorations and innocent festivities, had just become the backdrop for something far more sinister. And Miss Marple, settling her knitting more comfortably in her lap, prepared to observe what promised to be a most instructive demonstration of human nature under pressure. The first of the 3 murders before Christmas Eve had just been discovered, though none of them yet realized that it would not be the last. The small procession that wound its way from the village hall to St. Bartholomew's churchyard moved with the peculiar mixture of dread and curiosity that accompanies unexpected death. Snow had begun to fall in earnest now, soft flakes that settled on dark coats and transformed the familiar landscape into something ethereal and strange. Dr. Morrison led the way with his medical bag, followed by Colonel Weatherby, whose military bearing had automatically asserted itself, and the Reverend Dr. Blackwood, whose pale face suggested he was struggling with this violation of his sacred ground. Miss Marple had quietly joined the group, her presence so unobtrusive that no one questioned her inclusion. She had learned long ago that moments of crisis revealed more about human nature than years of ordinary social interaction, and she was determined not to miss what promised to be a most illuminating scene. The body lay exactly where young Timothy had described, crumpled against the ancient yew tree that had stood sentinel over Bramblewood's dead for more than 3 centuries. Even from a distance, it was clear this was no peaceful passing. The man lay at an unnatural angle, his limbs arranged in the careless sprawl that spoke of sudden violence rather than natural death. Dr. Morrison knelt beside the body with professional efficiency, his fingers seeking a pulse everyone knew he would not find. After several moments, he looked up with the grave expression of a man delivering unwelcome news. "He's been dead for at least 2 hours," he announced quietly. "Significant trauma to the back of the head, consistent with a heavy blow from a blunt instrument. This is definitely not a natural death." Colonel Weatherby stepped forward, his military training asserting itself. "Do we know who he is? I can't quite make out his features from this angle." It was Mrs. Cartwright who provided the identification, her voice barely steady. "It's Mr. Alastair Finch. He arrived from London yesterday, an antique appraiser. He was supposed to authenticate several items for today's auction, including—" She paused, glancing nervously at the others. "Including the Pemberton Silver Service." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the small group, and Miss Marple noted with interest the varied reactions it produced. Mr. Pemberton, who had reluctantly joined them, swayed slightly on his feet, his earlier relief now replaced by visible anxiety. Mrs. Harrington's face grew even more severe, while Miss Ashworth adjusted her spectacles nervously. "I spoke with him yesterday evening at the inn," Miss Ashworth said suddenly. He mentioned having concerns about certain pieces he'd been asked to examine. Said there were irregularities in the documentation that needed investigating before he could provide certificates of authenticity. Dr. Morrison stood, brushing snow from his knees. "We need to contact the police immediately. No one should disturb anything until they arrive." He glanced around the group. "This appears to be a deliberate attack. The wound is too precise for an accidental fall, and there's no sign of the weapon." As arrangements were made to telephone the county constabulary, Miss Marple lingered near the yew tree, her sharp eyes taking in details others might overlook. The ground around the body showed several sets of footprints in the soft earth, some clearly from their recent arrival, but older impressions as well. More interesting was a small piece of navy wool caught on one of the tree's lower branches, torn as if during a struggle. "Such a terrible coincidence," Mrs. Cartwright said, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow. "A man comes to authenticate valuable items, and now this happens. It makes one wonder about the timing." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Though in my experience, when someone dies just before they're about to reveal inconvenient truths, the timing is rarely coincidental. People can become quite desperate when their secrets are threatened." Mrs. Cartwright's carefully maintained composure flickered momentarily, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something that looked remarkably like fear in her eyes. As they returned to the village hall, where the abandoned Christmas bazaar waited in frozen tableau, Miss Marple reflected on the curious sequence of events. Questions about stolen silver, missing funds, and now a murdered authenticator. The connections were too numerous to be mere chance. Someone in Bramblewood had secrets worth killing for, and Mr. Finch had apparently gotten too close to the truth. The first murder before Christmas Eve had been committed, and Miss Marple suspected it would not be the last. In villages, she knew, secrets had a way of multiplying, and desperate people often found that one murder simply led to the necessity of another. The return to the village hall carried with it the peculiar atmosphere that follows violent death, a mixture of morbid fascination and barely suppressed panic that transformed the cheerful Christmas decorations into something almost grotesque. Inspector Davies from the county constabulary arrived within the hour, a methodical man whose 25 years of police work had taught him that village murders were often the most complex, involving webs of relationships and grudges that stretched back decades. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the abandoned tea stall, her knitting providing perfect camouflage for her keen observation of the proceedings. She had learned that people revealed more through their unconscious reactions than through their carefully prepared statements, and the current circumstances promised to be particularly illuminating. The whispered conversations that buzzed throughout the hall created a symphony of speculation. Mrs. Jenkins held court near the craft stall, convinced that London criminals had followed Mr. Finch to silence him. "Mark my words," she declared in theatrical whispers. "This is about more than stolen silver. That man knew something dangerous." Others favored more domestic theories, with Miss Ashworth timidly suggesting that perhaps someone in their own community had secrets worth killing for. Inspector Davies established his temporary headquarters where Mrs. Harrington's tea station had been, transforming the festive space into an impromptu interview area. His systematic approach began with Mr. Pemberton, whose obvious distress made him a logical starting point. The bank manager sat rigidly, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, his usually neat appearance disheveled. "I arranged to meet Mr. Finch this morning at 10 o'clock, Pemberton stammered, his voice barely steady. "He never appeared. I was at home preparing auction materials. My wife can verify that, though she was rather unwell and spent most of the morning in bed." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. Alibis, depending on ill spouses, were notoriously unreliable, particularly when delivered with such obvious reluctance. Mrs. Cartwright maintained her composure admirably during her interview, explaining her telephone call from London with practiced precision. A Hatton Garden dealer had recognized the Pemberton silver from photographs and raised questions about its connection to the Ashford estate theft 3 years earlier. "I felt it was my duty to inform the committee immediately," she said, though her fingers betrayed her anxiety as they twisted her wedding ring. Her alibi seemed solid, meeting her sister at the railway station, with the station master able to confirm the delayed 9:15 train from Bath. Colonel Weatherby's military bearing served him well, his responses crisp and factual. He had spent the morning reviewing committee financial records, with his housekeeper able to confirm his presence. However, his revelation proved most significant. "Finch expressed concerns about several auction items yesterday evening," he told Davies, his jaw tightening slightly. "Said there had been multiple cases recently of stolen goods appearing at charity auctions. He was particularly thorough about documentation." Miss Ashworth's interview revealed the most interesting details, though she seemed unaware of their significance. Her nervous habit of adjusting her spectacles intensified as she recounted her conversation with the deceased. He was quite insistent about examining all high-value items personally. Mentioned that ignorance about stolen goods wasn't always a defense in the eyes of the law. Her quick glance toward Mr. Pemberton was swift but unmistakable. He asked detailed questions about the Chinese vase donated by Mrs. Harrington and the Weatherby oil painting, not just the silver service. Mrs. Harrington herself responded with characteristic directness, though Miss Marple detected underlying tension in her controlled manner. She had arrived early for final preparations and been too busy to notice anything unusual. "The suggestion that anyone in our community would knowingly donate stolen goods is quite preposterous," she declared firmly. As the interviews concluded, Inspector Davies announced his preliminary findings. Mr. Finch had died from a single blow to the head, delivered by someone standing behind him. The absence of defensive wounds suggested surprise, possibly by someone he trusted. The revelation that emerged through the questioning painted a disturbing picture. Mr. Finch hadn't come merely to authenticate the Pemberton silver. He was conducting a broader investigation into questionable items that had appeared at recent charity auctions. Combined with the missing £300 from last year's bazaar, it suggested a systematic problem that someone had been desperate to conceal. Miss Marple gathered her knitting thoughtfully. 3 committee members had questionable alibis. Several had compelling motives for wanting Mr. Finch silenced, and everyone seemed to possess more knowledge than they admitted. The authentication expert's death had exposed a web of deception that entangled the entire committee, and she suspected this web was about to become considerably more complicated before Christmas Eve arrived. The morning following Mr. Finch's murder brought Inspector Davies to Bramblewood with renewed determination and a search warrant. The discovery that the deceased had been carrying detailed photographs of auction items from 3 different counties suggested a pattern far more extensive than a simple village dispute. Davies had spent the night reviewing the evidence, and Geoffrey Pemberton remained his primary focus. A man with clear financial motives and an increasingly questionable alibi. The search of Pemberton's modest cottage yielded results that seemed to confirm the inspector's suspicions. Hidden among meticulously kept household accounts, Davies discovered a series of unexplained cash withdrawals totaling exactly £300, the amount missing from the previous year's bazaar funds. More damning still was a notebook containing detailed sketches of the silver service, complete with measurements and notes about potential London dealers. When confronted with this evidence, Pemberton's composure finally cracked entirely. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he stammered, his hands shaking as he sat in his own parlor under Davies's stern gaze. "The money, yes, I took it, but only temporarily. I had debts, gambling debts from my London days that followed me here. I thought I could replace it before anyone noticed." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The silver service. I was trying to determine its value, nothing more. I thought perhaps if it was worth enough, I could sell it legitimately and repay what I'd borrowed." Inspector Davies made careful notes, his satisfaction evident. The case was falling into place with satisfying precision: financial desperation, opportunity, and a victim who threatened to expose everything. When pressed about his whereabouts during the crucial morning hours, Pemberton's story about his wife's illness began to unravel under scrutiny. Mrs. Pemberton, when questioned separately, could provide only the vaguest confirmation of her husband's presence, admitting she had been heavily sedated and might not have noticed his absence. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the cottage's small sitting room, found herself increasingly troubled by the proceedings. While Pemberton's financial difficulties were undeniable, something about the entire situation felt wrong to her experienced eye. The bank manager, she had observed, was meticulous to a fault. Surely such a careful man would have constructed a more convincing alibi if he had planned murder. More significantly, she remembered the small piece of navy wool caught on the yew tree branch, a detail that nagged at her since Pemberton had been wearing gray that morning. Her concerns deepened considerably when Dr. Morrison arrived with disturbing news about Colonel Weatherby. The military man had suffered a serious fall down his cottage stairs during the night, sustaining broken ribs and a severe head injury that had left him unconscious and hospitalized. The timing struck Miss Marple as highly suspicious. Another committee member incapacitated just as the investigation was intensifying. "Most unfortunate," she murmured to Dr. Morrison as they spoke quietly in Pemberton's garden. "I trust the colonel will recover fully." "Too early to say," the doctor replied grimly. "The head injury is quite severe. He managed to telephone for help himself, claimed he'd been lying there for hours. Odd thing is, Mrs. Patterson mentioned seeing lights in his cottage well past midnight. Makes one wonder what he was doing up at such an hour." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved thoughtfully as she processed this information. In her experience, when people involved in suspicious circumstances began suffering convenient accidents, it usually indicated someone was systematically eliminating complications. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. First Mr. Finch's murder, now Colonel Weatherby's incapacitation, and Geoffrey Pemberton being positioned as the perfect scapegoat. As Inspector Davies prepared to formally charge Pemberton, Miss Marple observed the reactions of the remaining committee members who had gathered outside the cottage. Mrs. Harrington displayed an air of grim vindication, as if long-held suspicions had been confirmed. Mrs. Cartwright seemed notably relieved, her earlier tension visibly easing. Most interesting was Miss Ashworth, whose distress appeared genuine and extended beyond mere sympathy for Pemberton's plight. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple suspected they were being arranged by someone who wanted them to fit a particular pattern. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one, particularly when it appeared so conveniently complete. Someone in Bramblewood was orchestrating events with considerable skill, using Pemberton's genuine financial difficulties to mask their own far more serious crimes. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected that Christmas Eve was still 3 days away, and she feared that Geoffrey Pemberton's arrest would not end the violence in Bramblewood. The real killer remained free, and desperate people often found that one murder simply necessitated another. The village of Bramblewood greeted Geoffrey Pemberton's arrest with the particular satisfaction that comes from having one's worst suspicions confirmed. By evening, the post office buzzed with retrospective wisdom as Mrs. Webb confided that she had always noticed something shifty about the bank manager's manner. At the butcher shop, Mr. Hargreaves declared that Pemberton's meticulous attention to exact change had struck him as rather calculating, while the hairdressers became a forum for whispered theories about poor Mrs. Pemberton's nervous condition being not entirely due to migraines, if you understand my meaning. Miss Marple observed this transformation of vague impressions into certain knowledge with the weary familiarity of someone who had witnessed such collective certainty before. In her experience, when a community embraced a solution too readily, it usually indicated they were avoiding more uncomfortable truth. The tidy resolution satisfied everyone's need to draw clear lines between wickedness and virtue, but life rarely obliged with such convenient simplicity. Determined to pursue her own quiet investigation, Miss Marple spent the following morning making what appeared to be social calls, but were actually carefully planned inquiries. Her first stop was the village library, where Miss Ashworth was attempting to maintain normal routines despite her obvious distress. The librarian's hands trembled as she arranged returned books, and she had developed a nervous habit of glancing toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Such a relief that the matter is settled," Miss Marple remarked gently, settling into a comfortable chair with her knitting. "Though you seem troubled, my dear." Miss Ashworth's reaction was immediate and revealing. "It's all wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the library's hushed atmosphere. "Geoffrey may have had money troubles, but he's not violent. Yesterday morning, around 9:30, I saw him hanging washing in his garden. His wife's nightgowns and sheets. A man planning murder wouldn't be doing household chores so calmly." This information struck Miss Marple as highly significant. If Pemberton was innocently doing laundry at 9:30, he could hardly have murdered Finch at the churchyard by 10 o'clock. The timeline Inspector Davies had established was clearly flawed, suggesting someone had deliberately manipulated the evidence. Her next revelation came from Mrs. Patterson, whose insomnia made her an inadvertent witness to the neighborhood's nocturnal activities. The elderly woman received Miss Marple eagerly, clearly relishing the opportunity to share her observations about Colonel Weatherby's accident. "Such odd happenings that night," Mrs. Patterson confided, settling into her favorite armchair. "The Colonel's lights were on until well past midnight, and I could swear I heard voices. More than one person talking quite animatedly. Around 11:30, I saw someone leaving by his back garden gate. Couldn't make out who it was in the darkness, but they moved as if they knew the property well. About an hour later came that dreadful crash and groaning." The implications were deeply troubling. If Colonel Weatherby had received a visitor shortly before his fall, it suggested his accident might have been anything but accidental. Miss Marple began to suspect that someone was systematically eliminating anyone who might possess inconvenient knowledge about the auction irregularities. Her afternoon visit to Mrs. Cartwright proved equally illuminating. The sophisticated newcomer received her graciously, but Miss Marple noted subtle changes in her demeanor. A forced brightness that didn't quite mask underlying anxiety, and a tendency to steer conversations away from recent events. "Such a relief that the police solved poor Mr. Finch's murder so quickly," Mrs. Cartwright said, serving tea in delicate china cups. "Financial desperation can drive people to terrible acts." Miss Marple observed her hostess carefully, noting that she wore a navy wool cardigan with what appeared to be a small tear near the left sleeve. Exactly the sort of damage that might result from catching on a tree branch during a struggle. The detail connected ominously with the piece of navy wool she'd observed on the yew tree where Finch died. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on her discoveries. Miss Ashworth's alibi for Pemberton, Mrs. Patterson's account of mysterious visitors, and Mrs. Cartwright's suspicious behavior all suggested that the real killer remained free. More troubling still was the realization that with Pemberton arrested and Colonel Weatherby hospitalized, the remaining committee members were being systematically isolated. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone had been stealing from charity auctions, using their position of trust to dispose of stolen goods through apparently legitimate channels. When Mr. Finch threatened to expose this scheme, he had been murdered. Now anyone who might possess dangerous knowledge was being eliminated or discredited. Christmas Eve was only 2 days away, and Miss Marple feared the killer's work was far from finished. The village of Bramblewood settled into the comfortable satisfaction that accompanies a mystery solved and justice served. Geoffrey Pemberton's arrest had provided the neat resolution that communities crave after violent disruption, and most residents were eager to return to their Christmas preparations. The post office buzzed with retrospective wisdom as neighbors recalled suspicious behaviors they claimed to have noticed all along, while the local shops hummed with theories about poor Mrs. Pemberton's nervous condition now being perfectly understandable under the circumstances. Miss Marple observed this collective embrace of certainty with the skeptical eye of someone who had witnessed such premature conclusions before. Inspector Davies, though professionally satisfied with his case, lingered in Bramblewood longer than strictly necessary, suggesting that some nagging doubt troubled his otherwise methodical mind. The evidence against Pemberton appeared conclusive, yet certain details refused to align as neatly as they should. Determined to pursue her own quiet investigation, Miss Marple made what appeared to be a social call on Mrs. Harrington, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the postponed Christmas service. She found the committee chairwoman in her immaculate drawing room, surrounded by the precise orderliness that reflected her controlling nature. "Such relief that this dreadful business is concluded," Mrs. Harrington declared, though her voice carried an edge that suggested relief was not her primary emotion. "Poor Geoffrey's betrayal has shaken us all, but at least we can move forward." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with gentle rhythm as she broached the subject that truly interested her. "Indeed, and to think with all the excitement we nearly forgot about those lovely auction items. That exquisite Chinese vase you donated, for instance. Miss Ashworth mentioned that Mr. Finch seemed particularly interested in it." The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Harrington's composure flickered, her hands tightening almost imperceptibly around her teacup. "Oh, that old thing? It's been gathering dust for years. Finch was rather thorough in his examinations, wasn't he? Perhaps too thorough for his own good." The slip was revealing. Mrs. Harrington's dismissal of the vase as worthless contradicted her earlier claims about its value, while her comment about Finch being too thorough suggested knowledge of his broader investigation. Miss Marple filed these observations away with the growing collection of inconsistencies that surrounded the case. Her afternoon visit to the Reverend Dr. Blackwood proved equally illuminating. The scholarly clergyman, surrounded by theological texts and church accounts, revealed a crucial detail that had escaped official attention. "Mr. Finch asked rather unusual questions," he confided, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "He wasn't merely authenticating items. He was examining our financial records, cross-referencing donations with committee members' known resources. Said he was looking for patterns of unexplained wealth flowing through charity channels." This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case entirely. Finch hadn't simply been investigating stolen goods. He had been conducting a comprehensive audit of the committee's financial activities. The missing £300 was merely the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of financial irregularities. The timeline problems that had been nagging at her suddenly crystallized when she encountered Miss Ashworth hurrying home from the library. The nervous librarian, emboldened by her earlier conversation with Miss Marple, provided the crucial detail that undermined the entire case against Pemberton. "I keep thinking about yesterday morning," Miss Ashworth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Geoffrey hanging washing in his garden at 25 minutes past 9. He called out a cheerful good morning and commented on the fine drying weather. A man planning murder wouldn't be doing domestic chores so calmly, would he?" The timing was impossible to reconcile with the official theory. If Pemberton was innocently doing laundry at 9:25, he could hardly have reached the churchyard, murdered Finch, and disposed of the weapon by 10 o'clock. Someone had deliberately manipulated the timeline to frame an innocent man. Miss Marple's evening walk through the churchyard revealed additional evidence that had been overlooked. A faint mark in the yew tree's bark, approximately shoulder height, showed where something metal had struck with considerable force. The angle suggested a missed blow during a struggle, while the small piece of navy wool still caught on a lower branch told its own story about the killer's clothing. As Christmas Eve approached with ominous inevitability, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. Someone with intimate knowledge of the committee's operations had been systematically exploiting their position of trust, using charity auctions to launder stolen goods and embezzle funds. When Finch threatened to expose this elaborate deception, he had been murdered by someone desperate enough to kill rather than face exposure. The real killer remained free, and Miss Marple feared their work was far from finished. The morning of December 23rd brought news that sent a chill through Bramblewood more penetrating than the frost coating every surface. Miss Ashworth had been found at the bottom of the library's stone staircase, unconscious and bleeding, her careful world of catalogued books scattered around her like fallen leaves. Mrs. Jenkins, arriving early to return an overdue novel, discovered the scene that would haunt her for years to come. The librarian lay crumpled at the base of the narrow stairs leading to the rare book collection, her spectacles shattered, her grey hair matted with blood. Scattered around her were volumes that had no business being consulted together, parish records from the 1890s, auction catalogues from neighboring counties, and, most significantly, a leather-bound ledger containing 5 years of detailed committee financial transactions. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed injuries consistent with a backward fall down the stone steps, though he confided quietly to Inspector Davies that the pattern suggested she had been pushed rather than simply slipped. More troubling still was the timing. Miss Ashworth had been found with her coat on and her keys in her pocket, suggesting she had been preparing to leave when the attack occurred. Miss Marple arrived at the library as Inspector Davies was conducting his preliminary investigation, her knitting bag providing perfect camouflage for her keen observation of the scene. The scattered books told a story that went far beyond a simple accident. Someone had been searching frantically through Miss Ashworth's research, looking for specific information that threatened their carefully constructed deception. "Most peculiar selection of reading material," Davies muttered, examining the fallen volumes. "These auction records span 3 counties and go back 7 years. What was she looking for?" The answer lay partially revealed in the leather ledger, where Miss Ashworth's meticulous handwriting had traced financial irregularities extending far beyond the current committee's activities. Her research suggested a systematic pattern of theft and money laundering that had been operating through charity auctions for years, using the respectability of village committees to dispose of stolen goods and embezzle funds. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple made several seemingly innocent social calls, each revealing additional pieces of the increasingly complex puzzle. Mrs. Harrington received her with characteristic efficiency, though her questions focused more on Miss Ashworth's condition than on her recovery prospects. "Such a dangerous staircase," Mrs. Harrington declared, her voice carrying an edge of satisfaction that struck Miss Marple as inappropriate. "Poor Prudence was always so careless about her footing. I do hope she recovers her faculties fully, though head injuries can be so unpredictable in their effects." The comment revealed more than intended. Mrs. Harrington's concern seemed centered on whether Miss Ashworth would regain consciousness rather than on her well-being, suggesting knowledge of what the librarian had discovered. Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Cartwright proved equally illuminating. The sophisticated newcomer appeared genuinely distressed, but her anxiety extended beyond normal sympathy. She wore her navy cardigan despite the indoor warmth, and Miss Marple noted how her fingers repeatedly worried at the torn sleeve. The same sleeve that had caught on the yew tree during her struggle with Mr. Finch. "Such a terrible coincidence," Mrs. Cartwright said, her voice strained. "First poor Mr. Finch, then Colonel Weatherby's accident, and now this. One begins to wonder if someone is systematically targeting the committee members." The observation was astute, though Miss Marple suspected Mrs. Cartwright knew more about the targeting than she admitted. Her knowledge of the library's layout, revealed through casual comments about book locations, suggested familiarity that went beyond normal patron usage. The Reverend Dr. Blackwood provided the most crucial information, though he seemed unaware of its significance. Miss Ashworth had approached him the previous evening, requesting access to historical parish records and expressing concerns about discrepancies in charity fund management that extended back several years. She seemed quite agitated, he confided to Miss Marple over afternoon tea. Said she had discovered a pattern that suggested systematic fraud, but wanted to verify her findings before making accusations. I gave her the keys to conduct her research privately. As evening approached and snow began to fall in earnest, Miss Marple reflected on the accelerating pattern of violence. 3 committee members now lay in hospital beds or morgues, while an innocent man sat in prison. The killer was systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their elaborate deception, and Christmas Eve was less than 24 hours away. The second attempt at murder before Christmas Eve had failed, but Miss Marple feared it would not be the last. Someone in Bramblewood was running out of time and options, and desperate people rarely hesitated when their survival depended on silence. The evening of December the 23rd brought a peculiar stillness to Bramblewood, as if the village itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Miss Marple sat by her parlor fire, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic rhythm, though her mind was far from the simple pattern taking shape in her hands. The attack on Miss Ashworth had confirmed her growing suspicions that someone was systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their carefully constructed deception. Her afternoon visit to Colonel Weatherby at the county hospital had provided the crucial confirmation she needed. Despite his injuries, the military man's mind remained sharp, and his testimony painted a disturbing picture of deliberate violence. "It wasn't an accident, Miss Marple," he had whispered, his voice hoarse but determined. "Someone broke into my cottage that night, searching through my desk where I kept the committee ledgers. They struck me from behind when I surprised them. I couldn't see their face, but they moved with surprising agility and wore something dark. Before I lost consciousness, I heard them muttering about coins and collections." The mention of coins had struck Miss Marple as significant, particularly when combined with the Colonel's earlier revelation about Mr. Finch's interest in more than just the silver service. The authentication expert had been investigating a broader pattern of stolen goods, including antique coins that had surfaced at various charity auctions. Inspector Davies arrived at her cottage as darkness fell, his expression troubled. "Miss Ashworth is conscious again," he reported, settling into the chair opposite her. "She's confirmed that someone pushed her down those library stairs. More importantly, she's identified a pattern in the financial records. The same person has been involved with high-value donations across multiple committees over the past 7 years. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "How very interesting. And I suppose this person has been careful to maintain an appearance of complete respectability?" "Exactly. Someone with access to committee records, knowledge of valuable items, and the social standing to avoid suspicion." Davies rubbed his temples wearily. "The problem is proving it. We need something concrete." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "we might encourage our quarry to reveal themselves. In my experience, when people believe their secrets are about to be exposed, they often take desperate measures to prevent it." Her opportunity came the following morning when Mrs. Cartwright arrived at her cottage in a state of barely controlled panic. The sophisticated veneer had cracked completely, revealing a woman terrified of exposure. "I must tell someone," Mrs. Cartwright gasped, her hands trembling as she accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea. "My husband. He's been involved in this business, though not directly in the murders. He works with people who use charity auctions to dispose of stolen goods. He told me to encourage certain donations, knowing they were part of stolen collections." Miss Marple observed her visitor carefully, noting the genuine fear in her eyes. "And Mr. Finch threatened to expose this arrangement?" "Yes, but I swear I didn't kill him. That night I was so frightened I went back to the churchyard to see if there was anything that could implicate me. I saw someone else there, near the yew tree, wearing a dark coat. They were stuffing something into a bag and moved very quickly when they heard me approach." The confession explained Mrs. Cartwright's suspicious behavior while revealing the existence of another figure at the crime scene. Miss Marple filed this information carefully, her understanding of the case continuing to evolve. Her afternoon visit to the Reverend Dr. Blackwood proved most illuminating. As they discussed the tragic events affecting his parish, Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed a small detail that had previously escaped attention: a distinctive pin on his lapel, featuring what appeared to be an ancient Roman coin. "Such an unusual piece," she commented mildly. "A collector's item, I imagine." The Reverend's hand moved instinctively to cover the pin. "A small indulgence," he said quickly. "I've always been fascinated by antiquities. This particular piece has special significance. It's from a collection I've been building for years." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The systematic nature of the thefts, the knowledge of valuable items, the access to committee records, and now evidence of a personal collection that might include questionable acquisitions. Someone had been using their position of trust and moral authority to legitimize an elaborate criminal enterprise. As Christmas Eve approached with ominous inevitability, Miss Marple reflected that the killer's desperation was making them increasingly careless. The third murder before Christmas Eve was yet to come, but she suspected it would not be long delayed. The most dangerous moment in any case came when the criminal realized they had been discovered, and that moment was rapidly approaching. Christmas Eve morning dawned with the crystalline clarity that follows fresh snowfall, transforming Bramblewood into a scene worthy of the most sentimental Christmas card. The village bells of St. Bartholomew's rang their ancient call to morning service, though the congregation that gathered was noticeably diminished, as if the recent violence had cast a shadow even over their most sacred traditions. Miss Marple made her careful way along the snow-covered path, her sharp eyes noting every detail of what she suspected would be the final act of a deadly drama. The Reverend Dr. Blackwood conducted the service with his usual scholarly precision, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tremor in his voice when he spoke of redemption and the weight of hidden sins. His sermon focused on the possibility of salvation, even for the most wayward souls, themes that struck several members of the congregation as particularly pointed given recent events. She noticed he wore his distinctive Roman coin lapel pin, his fingers straying to it whenever his composure seemed to waver. As the service concluded, Inspector Davies approached Miss Marple in the church porch, his expression grave with news that would prove decisive. "We've received the forensic report on Mr. Finch's briefcase," he said quietly. "Hidden in a secret compartment, we found a comprehensive list of stolen antiquities that have appeared at charity auctions across 3 counties over the past 7 years. The pattern is unmistakable. Someone with intimate knowledge of valuable items and unquestioned moral authority has been systematically laundering stolen goods through church fundraising events." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "And I suspect Mr. Finch had identified the person responsible?" "More than that. He had documented evidence linking specific stolen coin collections to donations made by someone with both numismatic expertise and access to parish records. The same person appears connected to every suspicious auction over 7 years." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into their final arrangement, and Miss Marple knew the moment had come to apply the careful pressure that would force the truth into the open. Her plan relied not on dramatic confrontation, but on something far more powerful: the systematic application of fear and guilty conscience that she had observed so many times in her long experience with human nature. Her opportunity came when Mrs. Harrington approached, her usual commanding presence somewhat strained by recent events. Miss Marple engaged her in seemingly innocent conversation about the investigation's progress, carefully mentioning that Miss Ashworth had recovered sufficiently to provide detailed testimony about her research findings. "Such a relief that her memory has returned so completely," Miss Marple observed mildly. She recalls quite clearly now who pushed her down those library stairs. More importantly, she remembers exactly what she discovered in those parish records. 7 years of systematic theft, all coordinated by someone with impeccable credentials and unquestioned access to valuable donations. Mrs. Harrington's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and her eyes flickered involuntarily toward the vicarage across the churchyard green. "You should be careful making such accusations, Miss Marple," she said sharply. "Such suggestions could drive a man to desperate measures, particularly someone whose reputation and authority depend on public trust." The warning was more revealing than Mrs. Harrington realized. Miss Marple filed away this confirmation of her suspicions, noting how the committee chairwoman's protective instincts had betrayed her knowledge of the true culprit's identity. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered churchyard, Miss Marple observed Dr. Blackwood's increasingly agitated behavior. He had been watching their conversation from the vestry window, and when Mrs. Harrington hurried across to speak with him privately, his composure finally began to crack under the mounting pressure. The final test came when Miss Marple made her way to the church for evening preparations, ostensibly to help arrange flowers for the midnight carol service. She positioned herself where her quiet observations would carry maximum impact, noting how Dr. Blackwood's hands trembled as he arranged the altar candles, how his eyes kept darting toward the narrow stairway leading to the bell tower. "Such a comfort to know the truth will finally come out," she remarked gently to Mrs. Cartwright, her voice carrying clearly across the nave. Miss Ashworth was quite specific about recognizing her attacker, the distinctive scent of church candles and that particular Roman coin pin. "So very ecclesiastical, don't you think?" The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Dr. Blackwood's hand flew to his lapel, his face draining of all color as he realized the trap had finally closed around him. For a moment, he stood frozen between flight and defiance, his scholarly mask slipping to reveal something far more desperate underneath. Then, with movements that spoke of a man who had run out of options, he turned toward the vestry door, his eyes calculating the distance to escape routes that no longer existed. The third murder before Christmas Eve would not take place. Miss Marple had ensured that the killer's final desperate gambit would fail before it could begin. The ancient nave of St. Bartholomew's held its breath as Dr. Blackwood stood frozen by the vestry door, his scholarly composure cracking under the weight of 7 years' accumulated guilt. Snow-filtered light cast fractured colors through the stained glass windows, illuminating a scene that would forever change Bramblewood's understanding of trust and respectability. Miss Marple remained seated in her pew, knitting needles moving with gentle precision, while Inspector Davies emerged from the shadows where he had been waiting at her quiet instruction. "I think we should discuss your collection more thoroughly, Dr. Blackwood," Miss Marple said mildly, her pale eyes fixed on the distinctive Roman coin pin adorning his lapel. "Particularly those pieces that Mr. Finch was so eager to authenticate before his untimely death." The Reverend's hand flew instinctively to cover the pin, his face draining of color. "This is preposterous," he stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Mere speculation and village gossip." "Oh, I'm afraid not," Miss Marple replied with characteristic gentleness. "You see, the evidence has been accumulating rather systematically. The navy wool fibers caught on the yew tree branch, matching the lining of your winter cassock. Your footprints in the churchyard soil, quite distinctive in their size and pattern. Miss Ashworth's clear recollection of your scent in the library, that particular combination of candle wax and incense that clings to clergymen. Most telling of all, your Roman coin collection includes pieces documented as stolen from the Ashford estate 3 years ago." Inspector Davies stepped forward, his notebook ready. "We've also traced the financial irregularities, Reverend. 7 years of systematically skimming auction proceeds, manipulating donation records, and using your position of trust to legitimize stolen antiquities through charity sales. Mr. Finch's investigation threatened to expose the entire network." Dr. Blackwood's scholarly mask finally slipped completely. revealing something desperate and cornered beneath. "You don't understand," he whispered hoarsely. It began so innocently. A few coins that needed proper appreciation, collectors who understood their historical significance. My clerical stipend barely covered basic needs, let alone allowed me to acquire the antiquities I'd devoted my life to studying. His confession poured forth with the relief of a man finally unburdening himself of an impossible secret. The criminal enterprise had grown gradually, beginning with minor authentication services for questionable dealers and evolving into a sophisticated network that used charity auctions across 3 counties to launder stolen goods. His position as a respected clergyman provided perfect cover, while his scholarly expertise made his authentication unquestionable. "Finch was going to destroy everything," Dr. Blackwood continued, his voice breaking. He'd traced patterns back to their beginning, identified every suspicious auction, every questionable donation. He showed me photographs of coins from my personal collection, pieces I thought were safely anonymous. When I met him in the churchyard that evening, I hoped to negotiate some accommodation. But he was inflexible, demanding full confession and restitution. The murder had been an act of desperation rather than premeditation. When negotiation failed, Dr. Blackwood had struck out with a heavy brass candlestick, never intending to kill, but panicking when Finch fell and didn't move. The subsequent attacks on Colonel Weatherby and Miss Ashworth were calculated attempts to eliminate witnesses whose military precision and librarian's thoroughness threatened to expose his carefully constructed deception. I pushed the colonel down his stairs when he confronted me with financial discrepancies, he admitted, and Miss Ashworth, her research into parish records was systematically uncovering my entire operation. I thought if she didn't survive the fall, the investigation would end. As Christmas Eve bells began their midnight toll, Dr. Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, his clerical collar removed, his scholarly reputation destroyed by greed and desperation. The ancient church that had been his sanctuary now stood witness to his downfall, its stone walls having absorbed the confession that ended his freedom. Miss Marple gathered her knitting thoughtfully, reflecting on how the most trusted figures in society could harbor the darkest secrets. Geoffrey Pemberton would be released and his name cleared, though his financial improprieties required addressing. Colonel Weatherby and Miss Ashworth would recover, both physically and professionally. The village would heal, though its innocence was forever lost. The 3 murders before Christmas Eve had been prevented through careful observation and gentle persistence. As Miss Marple walked home through the snow, she reflected that human nature remained remarkably consistent, capable of both remarkable kindness and shocking cruelty, depending on circumstances and the strength of individual character. Bramblewood would be peaceful again, though she knew that beneath its respectable surface, the eternal drama of human weakness and strength would continue to unfold. The Christmas morning that dawned over Bramblewood carried the peculiar quiet that follows revelation, as though the village itself were absorbing the weight of what had been exposed beneath its respectable surface. Snow continued to fall with gentle persistence, covering the churchyard where Mr. Finch had died and transforming the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's into something both beautiful and melancholy. The bells rang for morning service, but their notes carried a different quality, more reflective than celebratory, as if the old bronze remembered what it had witnessed. Inspector Davies arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with his final report, the satisfaction of a case solved, tempered by the complexity of its resolution. Dr. Blackwood's operation was far more extensive than we initially realized, he explained, settling into her familiar parlor chair. 7 years of systematic fraud involving over £15,000 and criminal networks across 3 counties. His expertise in antiquities made his authentication services invaluable to stolen goods dealers, while his clerical authority rendered his charity auctions above suspicion. The human cost, however, proved more significant than the financial damage. Geoffrey Pemberton had been released with his name cleared of murder, though his embezzlement of bizarre funds would require repayment through the sale of his cottage. His banking career was finished, but Mrs. Pemberton's nervous condition had improved dramatically once freed from the crushing weight of suspicion and guilty secrets. Colonel Weatherby's recovery proceeded with characteristic military efficiency, his broken ribs healing as his spirit responded to having his suspicions validated. From his hospital bed, he had provided investigators with meticulous financial records that traced the full extent of Dr. Blackwood's embezzlement, his precision proving invaluable in reconstructing years of carefully concealed transactions. Miss Ashworth emerged from her ordeal transformed, her near-death experience having burned away much of her natural timidity. Her methodical research into parish records had provided prosecutors with documentary evidence spanning the entire duration of Dr. Blackwood's criminal career, proving that quiet diligence could be more effective than dramatic investigation. Mrs. Harrington faced her own reckoning, her authoritarian management style having inadvertently created an environment where Dr. Blackwood's manipulations could flourish unchallenged. While not criminally liable, she had immediately organized a comprehensive audit of all committee accounts, her organizational skills now directed toward restoring institutional integrity. Mrs. Cartwright's confession about her husband's involvement had opened a broader investigation into the London-based network that exploited charity auctions throughout southern England. Her cooperation with authorities, motivated by genuine remorse, would help dismantle an entire criminal organization, though her glamorous facade now concealed a woman struggling to rebuild trust within her adopted community. It was the systematic nature of the deception that made it so effective, Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles moving with gentle rhythm as she processed the case's implications. Dr. Blackwood understood that the most successful criminals are those who appear most trustworthy. His scholarly demeanor and moral authority made questioning him seem almost sacrilegious. Inspector Davies nodded thoughtfully. I must admit, I was quite content with the case against Pemberton initially. The evidence seemed so convenient, so complete. Convenience, Inspector, is something one learns to be very suspicious of, Miss Marple replied mildly. In murder, as in housekeeping, the easiest explanation is often the result of someone's deliberate tidying. It was not merely the physical evidence that troubled me, but Dr. Blackwood's behavior, that particular unease of a man whose moral authority is unquestioned by others, but no longer certain to himself. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered landscape, the village began its slow process of healing. The Christmas service, conducted by a visiting clergyman, proceeded with subdued dignity, the congregation drawing closer together in their shared experience of betrayal and recovery. The ancient rituals provided comfort, reminding them that human dramas, however intense, were merely episodes in the longer story of community life. Mrs. Cartwright was observed leaving anonymous parcels at several cottages, food hampers for those whose Christmas would otherwise have been meager, her actions suggesting genuine penitence rather than mere social rehabilitation. The Pembertons' curtains remained discreetly drawn, though neighbors reported seeing lights and movement that suggested life continuing, if more quietly than before. Miss Marple spent the evening by her fire, reflecting on the curious constancy of human nature. In Bramblewood, as in so many places, people had revealed themselves capable of cowardice and courage, greed and generosity, systematic deception and quiet heroism, all within the space of a few winter days. The 3 murders before Christmas Eve had been prevented through careful observation and gentle persistence, though the cost to the village's innocence could never be fully calculated. As Christmas bells rang across the peaceful countryside and snow continued to fall, covering imperfections with an illusion of pristine whiteness, Miss Marple understood that while hearts could not be so simply renewed, the small, stubborn decencies that kept communities intact would eventually reassert themselves. Evil would always find new soil in which to grow, but so too would the ordinary virtues that made life bearable and occasionally beautiful. The weeks following Dr. Blackwood's arrest brought to Bramblewood the peculiar quiet that settles over communities learning to breathe again after holding their breath too long. Snow continued to fall intermittently, each fresh layer offering the comforting illusion that recent darkness could be covered over and forgotten, though Miss Marple knew from long experience that villages, like individuals, carried their scars long after wounds had healed. The practical aftermath. Inspector Davies concluded his investigation with characteristic thoroughness, his final report revealing the full scope of Dr. Blackwood's criminal enterprise. 7 years of systematic fraud had netted over £15,000, involving stolen antiquities laundered through charity auctions across 3 counties. The Church Restoration Fund, swollen with years of illicit proceeds, would be redistributed to legitimate charities and victims of theft. Dr. Blackwood's extensive coin collection, valued at over £8,000, would be returned to rightful owners where possible, with remainder sold to provide restitution. Geoffrey Pemberton's rehabilitation proceeded with touching dignity. His embezzlement, while inexcusable, seemed almost quaint compared to Dr. Blackwood's systematic criminality. The village's forgiveness came gradually but genuinely, helped by his obvious remorse and his wife's visible improvement once freed from the crushing weight of suspicion. He found employment with a neighboring village's bank, his meticulous nature and hard-learned humility making him oddly valuable to employers who understood that reformed embezzlers often made the most honest employees. Individual transformations. Colonel Weatherby's recovery brought unexpected benefits to the community. His military experience with financial fraud made him invaluable in establishing new safeguards for charitable organizations, while his brush with mortality had softened his sometimes rigid personality. From his wheelchair, he began teaching young people about financial responsibility, his lectures combining practical wisdom with cautionary tales drawn from recent experience. Miss Ashworth emerged from her ordeal, transformed in ways that surprised even those who knew her best. Her near-death experience had burned away much of her natural timidity, revealing a core of quiet strength that had always existed but never found expression. She established a village historical society, her research skills now directed toward preserving legitimate local history rather than exposing criminal deception. Her nervous habit of adjusting spectacles disappeared entirely, replaced by a steady gaze that missed very little. Mrs. Harrington threw herself into reorganizing committee structures with characteristic intensity, implementing oversight procedures that would have made military auditors proud. Her authoritarian tendencies, previously resented, now seemed almost comforting in their predictability. She had learned the hard lesson that trust without verification was mere negligence, though she struggled to balance necessary skepticism with the community spirit that made village life worthwhile. Mrs. Cartwright's position remained delicate but not hopeless. Her cooperation with authorities had proven genuine, and her husband's London business, purged of criminal connections, continued providing comfortable means. She channeled organizational talents into legitimate, charitable work, though she would never fully escape the shadow of earlier involvement. Trust, Miss Marple reflected, was like fine china. Once cracked, it could be mended, but would never again be quite as strong. Community healing. The village processed Dr. Blackwood's betrayal with a mixture of shock, anger, and gradual acceptance that follows profound disillusionment. How could their respected spiritual leader, the very embodiment of moral rectitude, have harbored such darkness? Christmas services resumed under a temporary clergyman whose earnest simplicity provided comfort after years of scholarly eloquence that had masked criminal calculation. Conversations carried the careful politeness that follows shared trauma. Residents emerging from cottages with cautious movements of people testing whether ground beneath their feet had truly stabilized. The familiar landscape seemed subtly altered, village life's cheerful facade permanently marked by revelation of such profound hypocrisy. Miss Marple's reflection. As January settled over Bramblewood with its promise of fresh beginnings, Miss Marple reflected on eternal patterns governing human behavior. Evil had taken root through exploitation of trust and authority, but had been defeated by the same quiet virtues that made village life possible: careful observation, patient investigation, and stubborn refusal to accept convenient lies when uncomfortable truths demanded attention. In her long experience, she had learned that murder was rarely the beginning of anything, but rather the end point of smaller, wrong choices left uncorrected, of indulgences excused, of secrets allowed to harden into habits. The 3 murders before Christmas Eve had been prevented through watchfulness and plain moral courage, though the cost to village innocence could never be fully calculated. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, did not change, but it could be understood, and understanding applied with patience and quiet attention could still prevent many tragedies. Outside her cottage window, snow softened Bramblewood's sharp edges, masking temporarily the scars of memory, while life continued its eternal mixture of wisdom and folly, kindness and cruelty.